History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 4 The Disputed Legacies of the Near East. The cultural influences playing upon the Mongol rulers and their circle were not only Chinese. There is much evidence of the importance of Nestorian Christianity at the Mongol court, and it encouraged European hopes of a rapprochement with the Khans. One of the most remarkable Western visitors to the Khan, the Franciscan William of Roebuck, was told after New Year 1254 by an Armenian monk that the great Khan would be baptized a few days later, but nothing came of it. William went on, however, to win a debate before him, defending the Christian faith against Muslim and Buddhist representatives and coming off best. This was, in fact, just the moment at which Mongol strength was being gathered for the double assault on world power against Sung China and the Muslims, which was finally checked in Syria by the Mamluks in 1260. Not that this was the end of the attempts by the Mongols to conquer the Levant. None was successful though. The Mongols' quarrels among themselves had given the Mamluks a clear field for too long. Logically, Christians regretted the death of Hushlagu, the last Khan to pose a real threat to the Near East for decades. After him, a succession of Il Khans or subordinate Khans ruled in Persia, preoccupied with their quarrels with the golden and white hordes. Gradually, Persia recovered under them from the invasions it had suffered earlier in the century. As in the East, the Mongols ruled through locally recruited administrators and were tolerant of Christians and Buddhists, though not at first of Muslims. There was a clear sign of a change in the relative position of Mongol and European when the Ilkhan began to suggest to the Pope that they should join in an alliance against the Mamluks. When Kublai Khan died in China in 1294, one of the few remaining links that held together the Mongol Empire had gone. In the following year, an Il Khan called Ghazan made a momentous break with the Mongol tradition. He became a Muslim. Since then, the rulers of Persia have always been Muslim, but this did not do all that might have been hoped, and the Il Khan died young, with many problems unsolved. To embrace Islam had been a bold stroke, but it was not enough. It had offended many Mongols, and in the last resort, the Khans depended upon their captains. Nevertheless, the contest with the Mamluks was not yet abandoned, though in the end unsuccessful. Ghazan's armies took Aleppo in 1299. He was prayed for in the Umayyad mosque at Damascus the next year. He was the last Khan to attempt to realize the plan of the Mongol conquest of the Near East, set out a half century before, but was frustrated in the end when the Mamluks defeated the last Mongol invasion of Syria in 1303. The Il Khan died the following year. As in China, it soon appeared in Persia that Mongol rule had enjoyed only a brief Indian summer of consolidation before it began to crumble. Ghazan was the last Il Khan of stature. Outside their own lands, his successors could exercise little influence. The Mamluks terrorized the old allies of the Mongols. The Christian Armenians, and Anatolia was disputed between different Turkish princes. There was little to hope for from Europe, where the illusion of the crusading dream had been dissipated. Though Mongol power ebbed away, there came one last flash of the old terror in the West as a conqueror appeared who rivaled even Chengiz. In 1369, Timur Lenk or Timur the Lame became ruler of Samarkand. For 30 years, the history of the Il Khans had been one of civil strife and succession disputes. Persia was conquered by Timur in 1379. Timur, who has passed into English literature thanks to Marlowe as Tamburlaine, aspired to rival Genghis. In the extent of his conquests and the ferocity of his behavior, he did. He may even have been as great a leader of men. Nonetheless, he lacked the statesmanship of his predecessors. Of creative art, he was barren. Though he ravaged India and sacked Delhi, he was as hard on his fellow Muslims as on the Christians, thrashed the Khans of the Golden Horde, defeated Mamluk and Turk alike, and incorporated Mesopotamia as well as Persia in his own domains. He left little behind. His historic role was, except in two respects, almost insignificant. One negative achievement was the almost complete extinction of Asiatic Christianity in its Nestorian and Jacobite form. This was hardly in the Mongol tradition, but Timur was as much a Turk by blood as a Mongol and knew nothing of the nomadic life of Central Asia from which Genghis came, with its willingness to indulge Christian clergy. His sole positive achievement was unintentional and temporary. Briefly, he prolonged the life of Byzantium by a great defeat of an Anatolian Turkish people, the Ottomans. In 1402, he prevented them for a while from going in to the kill against the Eastern Empire. This was the direction in which Near Eastern history had been moving ever since the Mongols had been unable to keep their grip on Seljuk Anatolia. The spectacular stretch of Mongol campaigning from Albania to Java makes it hard to sense this until Timur's death, but then it was obvious. Before that, the Mongols had already been overthrown in China. Timur's own legacy crumbled, Mesopotamia eventually becoming the emirate of the attractively named Black Sheep Turks, while his successors for a while still hung on to Persia and Transoxiana. By the middle of the 15th century, the Golden Horde was well advanced in its breakup. Though it could still terrorize Russia, the Mongol threat to Europe was long over. By then, Byzantium was at its last gasp. For more than 2 centuries, it had fought a losing battle for survival, and not merely with powerful Islamic neighbors. It was the West which had first reduced Byzantium to a tiny patch of territory and had sacked its capital. After the mortal wound of 1204, it became merely a small Balkan state. A Bulgarian king had seized the opportunity of that year to assure his country's independence as one of the several ephemeral successor states which made their appearance. Furthermore, on the ruins of Byzantine rule, there was established the new Western European maritime empire of Venice. The cuckoo in the nest which had been in the first place bribed to enter it. This former client had, by the middle of the 14th century, taken from the Byzantine heritage the whole Aegean complex of islands, with Rhodes, Crete, Corfu, and Chios. During that time, too, Venice had kept up a bitter commercial and political struggle with her rival Genoa, which had herself by 1400 acquired control of the southern coast of the Crimea and its rich trade with the hinterland of Russia. In 1261, the Byzantines had won back their own capital from the Franks. They did so with the help of a Turkish power in Anatolia, the Osmanlis. Two factors might still benefit the empire. The crucial phase of Mongol aggression was past, though this could hardly have been known, and Mongol attacks continued to fall on peoples who cushioned her from them. And in Russia, there existed a great Orthodox power, which was a source of help and money. But there were also new threats, and these outweighed the positive factors. Byzantine recovery in Europe in the later 13th century was soon challenged by a Serbian prince with aspirations to empire. He died before he could take Constantinople, but he left the empire with little but the hinterland of the capital and a fragment of Thrace. Against the Serbs, the empire once more called on Osmali's help. Already firmly established on the Asian shores of the Bosphorus, the Turks took a toehold in Europe at Gallipoli in 1333. The best that the last 11 emperors, the Paleologi, could manage in these circumstances was a rearguard action. They lost what was left of Asia Minor to the Osmalis in 1326, and it was there that the fatal danger lay. In the eastern Black Sea, there had an ally in the Greek Empire of Trebizond, a great trading state which was just to outlive Byzantium itself, but in Europe they could hope for little. The ambitions of the Venetians and Genoese, who by now dominated even the trade of the capital city itself, and the king of Naples, gave Byzantium little respite. One emperor desperately accepted papal primacy and reunion with the Roman Church. This policy did little except antagonize his own clergy, and his successor abandoned it. Religion still divided Christendom. As the 14th century wore on, the Byzantines had a deepening sense of isolation. They felt abandoned to the infidel. An attempt to use Western mercenaries from Catalonia only led to their attacking Constantinople and setting up yet another breakaway state, the Catalan Duchy of Athens, in 1311. Occasional victories when an island or a province was retaken did not offset the general tendency of these events, nor the debilitating effect of occasional civil war within the empire. True to their traditions, the Greeks managed even in this extremity to invest some of these struggles with a theological dimension. On top of all this, the plague in 1347 wiped out a third of what was left of the empire's population. In 1400, when the emperor traveled the courts of Western Europe to drum up help, a little money was all he got. He ruled only Constantinople, Salonika, and the Morea. Many in the West now spoke of him significantly as Emperor of the Greeks, forgetting he was still titular Emperor of the Romans. The Turks surrounded the capital on all sides and had already carried out their first attack on it. There was a second in 1422. John VIII made a last attempt to overcome the strongest barrier to cooperation with the West. He went in 1439 to an ecumenical council sitting in Florence, and there he accepted papal primacy and union with Rome. Western Christendom rejoiced. The bells were rung in all the parish churches of England, but the Orthodox East scowled. The council's formula ran headlong against its traditions. Too much stood in the way: papal authority, the equality of bishops, ritual and doctrine. The most influential Greek clergy had refused to attend the council. The large number who did all signed the formula of union except one. He significantly was later canonized, but many of them recanted when they went home. Better, said one Byzantine dignitary, to see in the city the power of the Turkish turban than that of the Latin tiara. Submission to the Pope was, for most Greeks, a renegade act. They were denying the true church, whose tradition orthodoxy had conserved. In Constantinople itself, priests known to accept the council were shunned. The emperors were loyal to the agreement, but 13 years passed before they dared to proclaim the union publicly at Constantinople. The only benefit from the submission was the Pope's support for a last crusade, which ended in disaster in 1441. In the end, the West and the East could not make common cause. The infidel was, as yet, battering only at the West's outermost defenses. French and Germans were absorbed in their own affairs. Venice and Genoa saw their interest might lie as much in conciliation of the Turk as in opposition to him. Even the Russians, harried by Tatars, could do little to help Byzantium, cut off as they were from direct contact with her. The imperial city and little else was left alone and divided within itself to face the Ottomans' final effort. The Ottomans, as they became known in Europe, were Osmanis, one of the Turkish peoples who had emerged from the collapse of the Sultanate of Rome. When the Seljuks arrived there, they found on the borderlands between the dissolved Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire a number of Muslim marcher lords, petty princes called Ghazis, sometimes Turkish by race, lawless, independent, and the inevitable beneficiaries of the ebbing of paramount power. Their existence was precarious, and the Byzantine Empire had absorbed some of them in its 10th century recovery, but they were hard to control. Many survived the Seljuk era and benefited from the Mongol destruction of the Seljuks at a time when Constantinople was in the hands of the Latins. One of these Ghazis was Usman, a Turk who may have been an Oghuz. He showed leadership and enterprise, and men gathered to him. His quality is shown by the transformation of the word Ghazi. It came to mean warrior of faith. Fanatical frontiersmen, his followers seem to have been distinguished by a certain spiritual elan. Some of them were influenced by a particular mystical tradition within Islam. They also developed highly characteristic institutions of their own. They had a military organization somewhat like that of merchant guilds or religious orders in medieval Europe, and it has been suggested that the West learnt in these matters from the Ottomans. Their situation on a curious borderland of culture, half Christian, half Islamic, must also have been provoking. Whatever its ultimate source, their staggering record of conquest rivals that of Arab and Mongol. They were in the end to reassemble under one ruler the territory of the old Eastern Roman Empire and more. The first Ottoman to take the title of Sultan did so in the early 14th century. This was Orkhan, Usman's son. Under him began the settlement of conquered lands, which was eventually to be the basis of Ottoman military power. Like his foundation of the Janissaries, the new infantry corps which he needed to fight in Europe. The change marked an important stage in the evolution of Ottoman Empire away from the institutions of a nomadic people, of natural cavalrymen. Another sign that things were settling down was Orkhan's issue of the first Ottoman coinage. At his death, he ruled the strongest of the post-Seljuk states of Asia Minor, as well as some European lands. Orkhan was important enough to be 3 times called upon by the Byzantine emperor for help, and he married one of the emperor's daughters. His 2 successors steadily ate up the Balkans, conquering Serbia and Bulgaria. They defeated another crusade against them in 1396 and went on to take Greece in 1391, when they began their first siege of Constantinople, which they maintained successfully for 6 years. Meanwhile, Anatolia was absorbed by war and diplomacy. There was only one bad setback, the defeat by Timur, which brought on a succession crisis and almost dissolved the Ottoman Empire. The advance was then resumed, and the Venetian Empire now began to suffer too. But for the Byzantine and Turk alike, the struggle was essentially a religious one, and its heart was the possession of the 1,000-year-old Christian capital, Constantinople. It was under Mehmed II, named the conqueror, that in 1453 Constantinople fell to the Turks and the Western world shuddered. It was a great victory, depleted though the resources of Byzantium were, and Mehmet's personal achievement, for he had persisted against all obstacles. The age of gunpowder was now well underway, and he had a Hungarian engineer build him a gigantic cannon, whose operation was so cumbersome that it could only be moved by 100 oxen and fired only 7 times a day. The Hungarians' assistance had been turned down by the Christians, though the fee he asked was a quarter of what Mehmet gave him. It was a failure. Mehmet did better with orthodox methods, driving his soldiers forward ruthlessly, cutting them down if they flinched from the assault. Finally, he carried 70 ships overland to get them behind the imperial squadron guarding the Horn. The last attack began early in April 1453. After nearly 2 months, on the evening of 28th May, Roman Catholics and Orthodox alike gathered in Saint Sophia, and the fiction of the religious reunion was given its last parade. The Emperor Constantine the 11th, eighth in succession since his namesake, the first great Constantine, took communion and then went out to die worthily fighting. Soon afterwards, it was all over. Mehmet entered the city, went straight to Saint Sophia, and there set up a triumphant throne. The church, which had been the heart of orthodoxy, was made a mosque. This was only a step, great as it was. The banner of Ottoman success was to be raised yet higher. The invasion of Serbia in 1459 was almost at once followed by the conquest of Trebizond. Unpleasant though this may have been for the inhabitants, it would merit only a footnote to the roll of Turkish conquest were it not also the end of Hellenism. At this remote spot on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea in 1461, the world of Greek cities made possible by the conquest of Alexander the Great gave its last gasp. It marked an epoch as decisively as the fall of Constantinople, which a humanist pope bewailed as the second death of Homer and Plato. Following words with action, he then took command of a crusading army but died before it could leave its base at Ancona. From Trebizond, Turkish conquest rolled on. In the same year, the Turks occupied the Peloponnese. 2 years later, they took Bosnia and Herzegovina. Albania and the Ionian Islands followed in the next 20 years. In 1480, they captured the Italian port of Otranto and held it for nearly a year. In 1517, Syria and Egypt were conquered. They took longer to pick up the remainder of the Venetian Empire, but at the beginning of the 16th century, Turkish cavalry were near Vicenza. Belgrade fell to them in 1521, and a year later, Rhodes was seized. In 1526, at Mohacs, the Turks wiped out the army of the Hungarian king in a defeat which is remembered still as the Black Day of Hungarian history. 3 years later, they besieged Vienna for the first time. In 1571, Cyprus fell to them, and nearly a century later, Crete. By this time, they were deep into Europe. They again besieged Vienna in the 17th century. Their second failure to take it was the high water mark of Turkish conquest. But they were still conquering new territory in the Mediterranean as late as 1715. Meanwhile, they had taken Kurdistan from Persia, with whom they had hardly ceased to quarrel since the appearance of a new dynasty there in 1501, and had sent an army as far south as Aden. The Ottoman Empire was to be of unique importance to Europe. It is one of the big differences marking off the history of its eastern from that of its western half. It was crucial that the church survived and was tolerated in the Ottoman Empire, that preserved the heritage of Byzantium for its Slav subjects and indeed ended any threat to the supremacy of the Patriarch at Constantinople, either from the Catholics or from ethnic Orthodox churches in the Balkans. Outside the former empire, only one important focus of orthodoxy remained. It was crucial that the Orthodox Church was now the heritage of Russia. The establishment of the Ottoman Empire for a time sealed off Europe from the Near East and the Black Sea, and therefore, in large measure, from the land routes to Asia. The Europeans had really only themselves to blame. They had never been, and were never to be, able to unite effectively against the Turks. Byzantium had been left to her fate. Who will make the English love the French? Who will unite the Genoese and Aragonese? Asked one pope despairingly, not long after one of his successors was sounding out the possibilities of Turkish help against France. Yet the challenge had awoken another sort of response. For even before the fall of Constantinople, Portuguese ships were picking their way southwards, down the African coasts to look for a new route to the spices of the East, and possibly an African ally to take the Turk in the flank from the south. People had mused over finding a way around the Islamic barrier since the 13th century, but the means had long been inadequate. By one of history's ironies, they were just about to become available as Ottoman power reached its menacing peak. Behind the Ottoman frontiers, a new multiracial empire was organized. Mehmet was a man of wide, if volatile, sympathies, and later Turks found it hard to understand his forbearance to the infidel. He was a man who could slaughter a boy, the godson of the emperor, because his sexual advances were refused. But he allowed a band of Cretans who would not surrender to sail away after the fall of Constantinople because he admired their courage. He seems to have been wanting a multi religious society. He brought back Greeks to Constantinople from Trebizond and appointed a new patriarch under whom the Greeks were eventually given a kind of self government. Turkish record towards Jews and Christians was better than that of Spanish Christians towards Jews and Muslims. Constantinople remained a great cosmopolitan city, and with a population of 700,000 in 1600, one far larger than any other in geographical Europe. Thus, the Ottomans reconstructed a great power in the eastern Mediterranean, and the 16th century was a great one for Islamic empire. But this was not only true in Europe and Africa. While the Ottomans rebuilt something like the Byzantine Empire, another power was emerging in Persia, which was also reminiscent of the past. Between 1501 and 1736, the Safavid dynasty ruled Persia, uniting all the Persian lands for the first time since the Arab invasions had shattered the Sassanids. Like their predecessors, the Safavids were not themselves Persians. Since the days of the Sassanids, conquerors had come and gone. The continuities of Persian history were meanwhile provided by the culture and religion. Persia was defined by geography, by its language, and by Islam, not by the maintenance of national dynasties. The Safavid were originally Turk, Ghazis like the Osmanis, and succeeded like them in distancing possible rivals. The first ruler they gave to Persia was Ismail, a descendant of the 14th century tribal ruler who had given his name to the line. At first, Ismail was only the most successful leader of the group of warring Turkish tribes, rather like those further west, exploiting similar opportunities. The Timurid inheritance had been in dissolution since the middle of the 15th century. In 1501, Ismail defeated the people known as the White Sheep Turks, entered Tabriz, and proclaimed himself Shah. Within 20 years, he had carved out an enduring state and had also embarked upon a long rivalry with the Ottoman, even seeking support against them from Holy Roman Empire. This had a religious dimension, for the Safavids were Shiites and made Persia Shiite too. When in the early 16th century the caliphate passed to the Ottomans, they became the leaders of Sunnite Muslims who saw the caliphs as the proper interpreters of the faith. The Shiites were therefore automatically anti Ottoman. Ismail's establishment of the sect in Persia thus gave a new distinctiveness to Persia's civilization, which was to prove of great importance in preserving it. His immediate successors had to fight off the Turks several times before a peace was made in 1555, which left Persia intact and opened Mecca and Medina to Persian pilgrims. There were domestic troubles too, and fighting for the throne, but in 1587 there came to it one of the most able of Persian rulers, Shah Abbas the Great. Under his rule, the Safavid dynasty was at its zenith. Politically and militarily, he was very successful, defeating the Uzbeks and the Turks and taming the old tribal loyalties which had weakened his predecessors. He had important advantages. The Ottomans were distracted in the west. The potential of Russia was sterilized by internal troubles, and Mughal India was past its peak. He was clever enough to see that Europe could be enrolled against the Turks. Yet, a favorable conjecture of international forces did not lead to schemes of world conquests. The Safavids did not follow the Sassanid example. They never took the offensive against Turkey except to recover earlier loss, and they did not push north through the Caucasus of Russia or beyond Transoxiana. Persian culture enjoyed a spectacular flowering under Shah Abbas, who built a new capital at Isfahan. Its beauty and luxury astounded European visitors. Literature flourished. The only ominous note was religious. The Shah insisted on abandoning the religious toleration which had until now characterized Safavid rule and imposed conversion to Shiite views. This did not at once mean the imposition of an intolerant system that would only come later, but it did mean that Safavid Persia had taken a significant step towards decline and towards the devolution of power into the hands of religious officials. After Shah Abbas's death in 1629, events rapidly took a turn for the worse. His unworthy successor did little about this, preferring to withdraw to the seclusion of the harem and its pleasures, while the traditional splendor of the Safavid inheritance cloaked its actual collapse. The Turks took Baghdad again in 1638. In 1664 came the first portents of a new threat. Cossack raids began to harry the Caucasus, and the first Russian mission arrived in Isfahan. Western Europeans had already long been familiar with Persia. In 1507, the Portuguese had established themselves in the port of Ormuz, where Ismail levied tribute on them. In 1561, an English merchant reached Persia overland from Russia and opened up Anglo Persian trade. In the early 17th century, his connection was well established, and by then Shah Abbas had Englishmen in his service. This was the result of his encouragement of relations with the West, where he adopted to find support against the Turk. The growing English presence was not well received by the Portuguese. When East India Company opened operations, they attacked its agents, but unsuccessfully. A little later, the English and Persians joined forces to eject the Portuguese from Ormuz. By this time, other European countries were becoming interested too. In the second half of the 17th century, the French, Dutch, and Spanish all tried to penetrate the Persian trade. The Shahs did not rise to the opportunity of playing off one set of foreigners against another. At the beginning of the 18th century, Persia was suddenly exposed to a double onslaught. The Afghans revolted and established an independent Sunnite state. Religious antagonism had done much to feed their sedition. From 1719 to 1722, the Afghans were at war with the last Safavid Shah. He abdicated in that year, and an Afghan, Mahmud, took the throne, thus ending Shiite rule in Persia. The story must nonetheless be taken a little further forward, for the Russians had been watching with interest the progress of Safavid decline. The Russian ruler had sent embassies to Isfahan in 1708 and 1718, then in 1723. On the pretext of intervention in the succession, the Russians seized Derbent and Baku and obtained from the defeated Shiites promises of much more. The Turks decided not to be left out and, having seized Tiflis, agreed in 1724 with the Russians upon a dismemberment of Persia. That once great state seemed to be ending in nightmare. In Isfahan, a massacre of possible Safavid sympathizers was carried out by orders of a Shah who had now gone mad. There was before long to be a last Persian recovery by the last great Asiatic conqueror, Nadir Kali. But though he might restore Persian empire, the days when the Iranian plateau was the seat of a power which could shape events far beyond its borders were over until the 20th century, and then it would not be the armies which gave Iran its leverage.